Okay, I think we are live. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar, Innovation and Biotech in a time of COVID-19. I'm glad you're joining us, and I'm thrilled to be joined by a panel of experts who are going to set into perspective the questions that we are discussing today. Let me introduce to you the faculty that we have. Rick Malley is a physician and infectious disease expert at the Children's Hospital in Boston. He's the chair of the Pediatric Infectious Diseases Service there. And he's also the founder of one of our companies at Lab Central, Affinivax, who are working on a pneumococcus vaccine, but have recently started to work on a new coronavirus vaccine as well. So we look forward to hearing your experience about that. Also with us, Hannu Rajaniemi. Hopefully I didn't butcher your name too badly. Hannu is from Finland, and he's a theoretical physicist by training, and also a writer of successful sci-fi novels that were already featured in Lab Central's book club recently. He's also the founder of HelixNano, one of our startups working with mRNA technology, typically on anti-cancer vaccines, but have recently pivoted and have been featured for that pivot to use their platform to develop a vaccine against the coronavirus. Last but not least, we're joined by Josh Resnick, Dr. Josh Resnick, who's a physician at the MGH emergency room service. And I know Josh through his other life as a venture capitalist in the Boston scene, where we're co-investing in some companies. And so Josh has an illustrious career through many venture funds and currently a partner at RA Capital in Boston, investing in early stage opportunities in healthcare. So with that, let's start. The format for all of you will be a 45-minute discussion that we have. It's now 1:33, so we have like 42 minutes left. We have an ability for the audience to ask questions of you that we will start that in the last 15 or 20 minutes. So that allows us to have some back and forth and address questions of interest for the audience. Now, with that as an introduction, all of us have been following the emerging crisis, and we are living under this new reality of being sort of contained at home because we want to help avoid a situation that would overwhelm our healthcare systems. Unlike we have seen this tragedy happen in Italy, for example, and close enough happen in New York. I'm thrilled to have Josh Resnick join us today, who's helping with that response from the ER at MGH. And Josh, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of how the reality looks there now, what has changed to previous months or a year ago, and how you see Boston is coping so far.
Great. Well, thank you, Hannes, and thank you everyone for joining. So I'd characterize the overall situation in Boston as sort of contained, a contained but pretty busy situation. We're certainly not seeing the level of challenges New York or Italy or other places like that face, and I think that's a combination of having the time to prepare, as well as a system, frankly, that has quite a bit of capacity in the greater Boston area, has quite a bit of capacity, particularly critical care capacity, and also quite a bit of planning, both in the recent past, but also in the long-term past, to prepare for things like this. So, it's busy. To give you a sense, MGH on a normal day has about 35 to 40 people on a ventilator, and as of today had about 160 to 170. So it's busy, but we're certainly not seeing the ventilator shortages that anyone that we had worried about. The biggest issue, and it's not I think the biggest capacity issue nationwide is really the medication shortage issue. which I published about in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago, and we're now starting to see that really hit. So we're starting to see shortages of all kinds of medicine, both critical care as well as, I could say, more basic care medicine, and that's quite problematic. And we haven't had yet the sort of focus on that or resource devoted to that as we did things like PPE and ventilators. So I think that's an emerging wave of challenge. But overall, I'd say the healthcare system is actually, aside from COVID stuff, which now comprises 80% or more of what's in the hospital, it's actually we actually have too much capacity in a certain way. So the hospitals, most of the hospitals regionally and nationally, are all well below capacity, which may seem like a good thing, but if you recall remember that hospitals run at 3 to 4% margins. If they're starting to see 30 to 40% downticks, which is about where MGH is versus year over year, that's a pretty that long term, medium to long term, that's actually pretty concerning situation for the stability and financial health of our healthcare system. I don't, ultimately places like MGH and the Brigham will be fine. But if you think about sort of more community hospitals that are really the backbone of the healthcare system in certain areas, it can be quite problematic. So net, acutely, I think we're overall in pretty good shape in terms of healthcare capacity in Boston. We're certainly face. I hate the word surge because surge sort of implies that it's going to come and go. And this isn't a surge. This is going to be, it's a big wave, but unless we're really cautious, we're going to have, bigger waves after this. And so we need to be thoughtful about that. But, we certainly seem to be handling at least this wave pretty well.
As you're describing the situation in the emergency room and you're seeing fewer of the regular admissions, I suppose, that you would expect, I am wondering, it's not like everybody is getting heart healthier or is having fewer strokes. In fact, the stress of being locked inside with no outlet may increase the stress levels for some people, or for many people. It does for me. So where are all these people going with their other internal medicine challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that will be, unpacked, for many years to come, I think. I mean, I think there's certainly, I think there is certainly, a natural piece of it that's, that's the result of people staying home, right? So you don't see trauma, you don't see, nearly the amount of violence, nearly the amount of overdoses or alcohol. And so that's largely gone away. It's an interesting question around, around STEMIs and strokes and sort of the things that you would think are stable. There's no doubt that some of these are happening at home, and a month or two from now or 6 months from now, we're going to start seeing some of the complications that medicine hasn't seen in this country hasn't seen for decades, right? Since before the advent of stents, cardiac stents. But it does seem like there's some piece of it that is just a reduction in the overall volume of these things, and whether that is stress related or something else, people not eating out and having a big steak dinner, who knows? It's really interesting, but but it's across the board, right? So bread and butter ER stuff, appendicitis, GI bleeds, right? It seems to have COVID seems to be all there is. And some of it is people staying home probably too long, but some of it seems to be fundamental, which is really interesting and will take a long time to unpack.
Rick, as another physician in the Boston system, we were all very worried about the potentially overwhelming cresting wave of cases coming fast and furious at our hospitals in Longwood. Is there at your hospital, at the Children's Hospital in Boston, do you see that reality happening? I know that pediatric patients are typically very lightly affected, if at all, by this disease. So what's your daily practice like?
Yeah, so thanks, Johannes. So the situation at Boston Children's is an interesting one in that in preparation for exactly what Josh was talking about, most of the adult hospitals that also had a pediatric intensive care unit and a pediatric ward kind of shuttled all those patients to our institution so that they could accommodate the patients, the adult patients that they were expecting and that they are seeing now in their own hospitals. So our institution then decided to try as much as possible to expand the capacity by, of course, like many hospitals, restricting surgeries to only those that are urgent or emergent, and canceling all sorts of elective admissions and elective surgeries, so that our hospital is now functioning at a significantly lower census than usual for any time of year. That has had a very important impact on our ability to take care of the sickest kids, because there's essentially, just like Josh described, there's not at this moment any sense that we are being overwhelmed. At the same time, what has happened, which is very interesting and something that we're guarding ourselves against, is because we are all so much focused on COVID-19, we're all thinking coronavirus, that we have to double check, triple check to make sure that we are not missing important, relevant diagnoses because we're so focused on the concern for COVID-19. So in my hospital, that's one of the things that we're striving, and I think we're doing very well, is to really make sure that all the important diseases that we normally see are not being somehow mismanaged or managed differently because we're so worried about COVID-19. And I think the house staff, the nursing staff, the attendings, everybody is trying to sort of walk that tightrope where you are, on the one hand, being very much aware that COVID-19 can certainly affect children. It can certainly make them sick, even though it's less likely than an adult patient. We also have an immunocompromised population, and we're trying to sort out what the risks are to immunocompromised patients as well, because it's not as clearly defined as we thought it would be. But at the same time, not make a mistake of missing an important, for example, bacterial infection that could mimic, for example, what COVID-19 could look like.
And of course, you're an infectious disease doc. So while this is a terrible pandemic, it should somehow satisfy you that at least for the moment, people are paying attention to your subfield of medicine, which has been somewhat appreciated, I believe, in the past many years.
Well, I think everybody listening to this webinar and all of the participants would agree that most of us would be happy to live in obscurity compared to what we're living through right now. But I do get your point. I think that one thing that's going to be very important for us to decide, not just as a nation, but truly worldwide, is why is it that, by and large, most countries were completely unprepared for such a pandemic situation when there were so many clues that are easy to see in retrospect, but that were clearly missed, or in any case, not acted upon the way you would hope our country and other very developed and advanced countries could have worked on. Because what's going to happen, and we all fear this, is that not only are we going to be constantly fighting the last war and sort of like being behind on what we should be doing, but while everything we're describing today to your audience has to do with the care that we're providing in a highly developed setting, we have to take pause and think for a few minutes about what the impact of this pandemic is and will be on countries that do not have anywhere near the healthcare infrastructure and the economic strength that we do. And really, those countries are the most vulnerable. And we're already seeing what happens even in our city. And I think Josh could describe this very well. With the vulnerable population, the individuals who are underrepresented, less privileged and disenfranchised, those are the patients in Boston that are suffering predominantly from this disease, much more so than people who are in different settings. And so I worry very much about what's going to happen to that population in American cities, and even more globally in the population abroad.
So one of the rules for this, thank you, Rick, one of the rules for our webinar is to silence your phones, or to be on mute at least, so note to self. Of course, we're only going to get out of this. I don't think we can contain this virus any longer. So we can get out of this only by developing, as a society, immunity at a large scale. And of course, the vaccine efforts, and we're going to come back to what Affinivax is doing on this, have to help us out of this. Hannu is running this little venture-funded startup with a co-founder and a small number of employees at Lab Central. And you've decided early on that you thought your platform could be useful to develop a vaccine What makes you optimistic? And or maybe even let's start by having you describe a little bit your platform as it is, and why do you think your approach is needed, and what made you pivot? And then let's talk a little bit about your practical experiences in shifting your work over to this new challenge.
Absolutely. So a little bit of context on HelixNano. So it was co-founded by myself and Nikolai Erashenko, who did his PhD with George Church. And what our mission really was, and still is, I'll come back to that, is to bring all the latest tools and technologies from synthetic biology to oncology. And early on, we chose messenger RNA as our modality because we felt that if we wanted to be able to deliver any biological part into the human body, anything we could possibly design, then we had to choose a genetic modality that expressed the payload, the biologic payload in the patient's cells. And RNA seemed like the natural choice because not only it gave you all this flexibility for design, but also behaved more like a drug, that you weren't permanently modifying the patient's genome or having a very long-term expression like from a viral gene therapy vector. And there were basically then two threads to our work. We built a whole technology stack around mRNA, from manufacturing to manipulating the innate immune system to then specific protein payloads. And we actually had, as the crisis hit, so two therapeutic leads, so mRNA encoded proteins expressed intratumorally that both showed quite promising efficacy in terms of directly shrinking tumors in animal models and recruiting an immune response against them. So we had this therapeutic direction. And then in parallel, we were also working on cancer vaccines, or neoantigen cancer vaccines. And so that was philanthropically funded work with support from one of Eric Schmidt's philanthropic vehicles, Schmidt Futures. And there, the ultimate goal was actually to go beyond the therapeutic applications of neoantigen vaccines that are now currently in clinical trials, and actually think about prophylactic cancer vaccines for non-viral cancers. And one of the main challenges there was really to be able to counteract cancer evolution, to recruit an immune response against multiple antigens simultaneously, rather than just one dominant one, which tends to be the case currently. So we started thinking of mRNA-based technological approaches, how to overcome this phenomenon of epitope dominance. How could you actually develop a multi-antigen cancer vaccine? And then as the COVID-19 situation started unfolding, we had an opportunity to learn a little bit about one of the leading vaccine programs from a biopharma company that we've been chatting to, and then realized that there were some gaps in this landscape of efforts. Or actually, one of our first observation was that the nature of most of the vaccine efforts was highly uniform. Pretty much everybody was following the same strategy, which was to use the full spike protein as the antigen. So spike protein being the protein through which the virus binds to the ACE2 receptor and actually enters cells. And a concern. So if you look at the WHO list, I think there's like something like 60 projects there now. There's probably more now. Something like 80% of them, 70 to 80%, declare that they're doing either full spike protein or spike trimer or some variant thereof. And so to us, this was concerning because in the context of the previous coronavirus or SARS-CoV-1, spike-based vaccines were shown to cause this phenomenon of antibody-dependent enhancement of infection in animal models. So what this means is that if your vaccine stimulates the production of a non-neutralizing antibody against your antigen, you've now given the virus a new receptor, a new tropism to actually be able to infect immune cells. And obviously, we still don't know whether this is a major risk for SARS-CoV-2, But if it follows the same pattern as SARS-CoV-1, to which it shares quite a lot of homology, it could well be a big risk. So that was one of our worries, essentially ADE and the uniformity of all the vaccine strategies. The other worry was that even if the current wave of vaccine efforts is successful, there is a chance that we will see evolution of the virus. Now we know that it's not evolving as quickly as the flu, for example, but there's already been observations of mutations that do seem to make a functional difference in terms of, for example, changing the affinity of ACE2 binding. So there is a risk of antigen drift. And also a risk of a seasonal version of the virus that keeps coming back. And then, of course, there is still this reservoir of other coronaviruses that, of which this is probably not the worst, nor the last. So those were the two problems we wanted to address: how to avoid ADE and how to actually solve this problem long term. And I think that felt like a natural role for us as a small company. We probably can't compete with all the bigger players in terms of speed or scale up or speed to the clinic. But what we can be is a hedge against all these strategies failing. So applying a very different approach where we do explicitly avoid ADE and try to create a broader, more cellular-based immunity that could also protect the population from future coronaviruses. So that was the reasoning behind why we wanted to jump into this.
Is there a commercial? Is this just you doing the right thing, or do you actually think as an entrepreneur there's a commercial opportunity for your company to develop something in the long term?
Oh, absolutely, and that's kind of what relates to what I alluded to earlier, that we haven't given up on the long-term mission of the company. I think we are now in this unique situation where there's a massive need to rapidly deploy, develop, and scale new vaccine technologies. So purely from the company perspective, for us, this could be a way to validate our technology in this application while doing the right thing. But our long-term plan is actually to bring the learnings from that and the validation from that back to cancer. And it might be that the landscape of how we think about vaccines and healthcare as a whole ends up shifting. And therefore, our vision for a prophylactic pan-cancer vaccine can actually become a reality. So a lot of things that were not possible before, there might now be a viable path towards.
Josh, in your practice, I know that while you started out as a physician, your daily practice mostly is now in the entrepreneurial realm and supporting teams and working on identifying and then nurturing investments in the healthcare field. What do you see this crisis, what effects do you foresee, or does RA Capital think will be coming out of this crisis in terms of funding for entrepreneurial ventures, funding for infectious diseases opportunities? And so is this a good thing in the long run? Is it a bad thing, or is it a neutral thing? How are we going to go through this? What's the investor's point of view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably split that into sort of a near-term acute set of issues and then kind of a medium to longer term set. And I think in the acute term, what we're actually seeing is a few things, right? We're seeing the companies that are, I wouldn't say they're struggling, but the companies that are facing the greater challenges in terms of meeting their timelines and executing with the cash they have on hand are the later stage clinical companies, right? So clinical trials are clearly slowed down, if not shut down. It's not totally clear how long that will last. My prediction, it's only a prediction, is that what we see is sort of for the next year or so, a rolling set of trials, right? The trials aren't totally shut down, but you have local. Once we get over this sort of global wave, will have local upticks that'll hit trials that'll have happening on modality. So overall trials will slow down, but I'm optimistic that they're not going to be shut down for 6 months to a year. But those are the companies that, both by the nature of how much they burn in cash naturally, as well as what they need to accomplish that are most at risk in terms of meeting their timelines. The research stage, discovery stage companies are actually faring okay. Because of Lab Central and other labs, people are able to get into their labs, and while maybe doing less work than or less density in the labs than previously, they're able to do their work. The CROs are still operating, both US and OUS, and so far, and there's no reason to think this is going to change dramatically. The ability to make progress on early stage programs has actually been impressively strong. Not to say there have been challenges, but it's been not terrible. The financing environment, I mean, my sort of rosy outlook on it is that I think the ease with which companies had raised capital over the last 5+ years had led to some bad habits around capital efficiency, and maybe some things getting funded that didn't necessarily need to get funded, that weren't necessarily accomplishing really fundamental improvements in human health. And so, yes, there'll be some disruption and absolutely some pain over the next year or so. But I think where we're going to come out of this is actually healthier, right? We're going to come out with a more focused, more milestone-driven biotech industry that really focuses on producing, discovering and producing therapeutics that have fundamental impacts on human health. You asked about, but all that said, there's going to be absolutely some short to medium term disruption, and some companies that probably shouldn't fail may end up failing, but the long-term outlook, I think, is actually quite strong. The question on infectious disease is an interesting one. I mean, one would hope that both for antivirals as well as, importantly, antibiotics, this spurs research and activity. I guess I'm not massively optimistic, because until the fundamental market forces that drive those industries change in a more rational way, so that companies that discover important therapeutics are actually compensated for discovering those therapeutics, we still have a problem. And so there are lots of public policy ways to address that we don't need to go into, but I think that this wave of interest, until that's fixed, this wave of interest in that will give way and lessen until we as a nation and we as a globe address the fundamental problems with how we compensate for risk taken for developing those important therapeutics.
Yeah, we would hope that this gives us a way to get better prepared for the next such crisis, or maybe even use some of these learnings to invest in infectious diseases. I want to come back, because I'm learning a lot these days about vaccines and the likely efficacy of vaccines and the testing for antibodies, and whether or not we'll actually get any meaningful immunity out of that, and want to ask Rick to comment on that. In those, and I know that Affinivax is working on your own vaccine. I think there are some interesting parallels with the thinking that Hannu already shared with us in your own background. But maybe you tell us a little bit about that effort, but then I want to take it a little broader from there and hear from you what you think need to be the features in general for a vaccine to be protective to the level that we need it to be at the population level, where we all want to go back to a concert and to a movie theater and to enjoy community again. That seems out of reach right now. So what are the features of a successful vaccine?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think the two questions are precisely why Affinivax, and it sounds like other companies like Hannu's, have been focused on sort of shifting gears and moving into a space that may not be immediately obvious as the one that they started their company with. So in the case of Affinivax, we have been focused for 6 years or so, 6-7 years, on the development of vaccines against various bacteria, including pneumococcus, nosocomial bacterial infections, and so forth. But at the same time, we had recognized that what we wanted to do was to establish comprehensive protection against pathogens, meaning not just antibody generation, but also T cell, both CD4s and CD8s. That had applications also for cancer and other rheumatologic and immunological diseases. And so when COVID-19 shows up, this is a pathogen against which, exactly as Hannu pointed out, most of the efforts right now are truly directed against generating antibodies, either against the S protein or more specifically against the receptor binding domain. And the question really ends up being, is that going to be enough? I think it's implicit in your question, Johannes. Is that enough? Is that truly the mechanism through which individuals, if that is the case, become immune to SARS-CoV-2? And the honest truth is we don't know at this moment, but we are making the bet through Affinivax. It's a bet that at this stage is maybe a pessimistic one, but I think it's important to be realistic that generating antibodies to the S protein or even to the receptor binding domain alone may not be sufficient to affect the broad range annihilation of this virus that we're really hoping to achieve. And so there are lots of studies, both based on SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, to suggest that antibodies alone may not be the only players in immunity, that you might need some CD8 T cells, for example. Exactly as Hannu mentioned, there's this concern that the wrong type of antibody it's difficult to generate, to know which one you're going to generate, could in fact enhance pathology, has been shown in non-human primates, for example. And so for all these reasons, we decided to use our platform technology, which generates antibodies to proteins and also T cell responses to proteins, to try to see if we can jump in on this effort. One of the risks, of course, and it's a risk that we welcome, is that in the next few years, one of the current efforts leads to fruition. That would be honestly an amazing and remarkable success. I think the quotes that we've heard early on of a 12 to 18 month period before we have a vaccine, and I don't mean to depress the audience, but honestly, I think that is a massive reach. No vaccine, to my knowledge, has been developed in such a short period of time. And even if you have proof of concept in 12 to 18 months, it's going to take a very long time for the vaccine to be produced in the billions of doses that you need to really try to eliminate the disease. And as I think many of your viewers know, that was one of the reasons why Bill Gates has proposed, and in fact has started, the process of funding the manufacture of several candidates going at risk, and essentially assuming that if only one of them works, you will still be ahead of the game than if you waited to find out which was the winner to start proceeding with the scale up that is required for manufacture. So in that respect, what Affinivax and other companies are doing is saying, look, we understand that there are other companies that are already there in clinical trials, but if they succeed, that's great. If they do not succeed, and even if they do succeed but cannot scale up, it would be very important to have alternatives such as the one that Affinivax is trying to develop. In terms of what immunity should look like for us to eliminate this disease, I think there's the long, hard way of generating enough herd immunity so that this disease becomes a little bit more like the flu, where basically you have a large number of deaths each year, but it is not, as flu induces every year in the elderly, but not the catastrophic numbers that would happen if, in fact, this virus entered a completely naive population. That is that would be a very sad reality if that's what we have to do. And I think that the development of either vaccines in the medium term, or hopefully in the short term, the development or the repurposing of a drug that works to prevent the mortality and severity of this illness would be a game changer. Now, what might happen is we might develop a vaccine that limits the severity of this disease. It doesn't necessarily prevent transmission. And then you would need a lot of doses of this vaccine so that everybody, to a certain extent, can benefit from that protection. But I think absolutely the holy grail would be a vaccine that not only protects the individual, but also induces enough immunity so that the community at wide, those who cannot get the vaccine or who have not received the vaccine or who don't respond because, for example, they're elderly and their immune response is a little bit senescent, that there'd be enough protection in the community to generate the community protection that we really need to obtain to fight this disease.
we don't want to end on your negative, on your realistic view of immunity and the ability to create vaccines quickly. I do have a number of questions from the audience that I will the triage from. A quick one, yes or no, I think that goes to Josh. An ER doc wrote in the New York Times today that COVID pneumonia is insidious because the symptoms appear so late and sudden. Do you, and they propose to use pulse oximeters at home. Do you agree or disagree with that idea?
So that was written by Rick Levitan, who is my mentor at Penn. So I will, of course, agree with him. This is a long and complicated answer to a short question. Bottom line is, I think that there's a lot of mythology going on that somehow COVID is poisoning the blood in a funny way, or hitting hemoglobin, or doing something fundamentally different. I think really what we're seeing, and Rich pointed this in his article in the Times, his note in the Times. Really, what we're seeing is healthy people that don't have come in with multiple diseases, getting very severe lung disease, and when that happens, they're not septic, they're blowing off their CO2, so they're not in respiratory distress. They're just profoundly hypoxic. But we don't feel hypoxia really unless you have flow limiting cardiac disease or something. You're not feeling hypoxia, and so that's why they're sitting around and texting with oxygen saturations in the 70s. So there's nothing different about this disease than any other ARDS. It's just that the breadth of the population it's hitting makes it look funny. That's my belief, at least.
Okay. Here's a question for Hannu. And maybe this you answer this with your futurist hat on. I'm always thinking that writers of sci-fi novels must have a different view of the future, and maybe you have a more privileged or freer thinking of the future. The question is simply, what do you think is going to be the societal impact of this disease for us going forward? Is there something that we can anticipate? Are there positive, negative, neutral implications that you foresee in the future? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No. I think science fiction writers don't really have a particularly privileged view or any insights into predicting the future. I think we ultimately are talking about the present day, and Ray Bradbury described it as, like Perseus who went to slay the Medusa with the mirror shield and only looked at the mirror image of Medusa and not at Medusa directly. That's kind of how we actually do it. So you're looking at the future through this funny, or the present day through this funny reflection that you create. But of course, it is a fascinating situation. And I think a lot of the changes that we are seeing now may well end up having enormous impact. I mean, I think work, education, healthcare are all being transformed right now, being moved to operate in this remote manner, and that will certainly drive all kinds of technological development and social phenomena as well that are very hard to predict. But to kind of try to go more towards the silver lining of this cloud, I think a big mindset shift could come from a kind of collective realization that in global crises, our individual actions really do matter. This is a rare crisis where everything we individually do really matters, whether we wear a mask, whether we wash our hands, whether we stay at home. That all makes a difference, because every interaction, every potential exposure to infection that we create is so exponentially amplified through other interactions. So here we have a situation where individual incentives to act correctly and global incentives are really aligned. And I think people are realizing that, and that may lead to a significant mindset shift that could have huge impact, for example, on how we in the future think about climate change. So in a way, maybe this is like a test run for dealing with much bigger global problems in the future. Another thing I'm very excited about personally is, seeing projects like the oximeter project that you mentioned, that Joshua talked about, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, has also been pulling in volunteer software developers to help build solutions around ideas like this, where there's a lot of these emergent crowdsourced ideas that are to whether it's to 3D print PPEs, whether it's to develop new diagnostic methods or solve many of the other problems, or even do testing efforts, like there was this grassroots organized testing effort in the town of Bolinas in California very recently, where a group of entrepreneurs organized an effort to test 3,000 people in a small town very rapidly. I mean, so this kind of sudden ability and urge to solve big problems collectively in a decentralized way is, to me, very exciting. And I think if we see these kinds of models being applied to more problems in the future, I think we may be looking at some real positive change that comes out of all of this.
Hope you're right. We in Massachusetts still need to get to the massive testing effort to be on the safe side of this. Here's a question that sort of goes back to your comment, Rick, about antiviral therapeutics. It goes as follows: is immunomodulation a viable COVID therapeutic strategy, or do we need a direct-acting antiviral?
That's a great question. I think, so your audience probably knows that there has been a few hyped up therapies that so far are completely unproven. And the most famous one is hydroxychloroquine, which was in fact mentioned in a White House briefing, probably at a time where there was even less, certainly at a time where there was even less information about this drug. But this drug was proposed as both an antiviral in preventing, if you will, the virus from actually surviving once it is inside the cell, and also as a anti-inflammatory, which is how it is used by many patients with lupus, for example. And what I think is becoming clear right now is that this drug has no demonstrable, at least from what I can see in the literature, no demonstrable effect as an antiviral drug. And what the jury is still out on, I think, is whether it has any anti-inflammatory effect that could be beneficial. We know it has anti-inflammatory effect, but whether it's beneficial, again, the jury's out. And in general, in medicine, when you have no information, the tendency should be to study it in a trial rather than just implement it on everybody. But that's unfortunately the situation we're in now. I think that in answer to that question, you could envision a drug that either works early, for example, Tamiflu against influenza is a drug as a neuraminidase inhibitor that really has most of its benefit early on in the disease. Later on in the disease, it's pretty clear that it has very minimal efficacy. In contrast with COVID-19, where the third phase of illness of these subjects really seems to be associated with a systemic inflammatory response syndrome, with a highly inflammatory state. I think the audience knows about these studies looking at TNF and IL-6 and a number of cytokines that are IL-1 that are elevated in these patients. And the question is a very viable one, whether an anti-inflammatory effect at that time, or even just prior to the third phase, once you know that the subject is really getting sicker, whether that would be beneficial. I think, and I think most scientists and physicians agree with this, that the best way to study this is through randomized controlled trials. They're difficult to perform in the context of a pandemic, but they're all the more important because otherwise you end up in an absurd situation where individuals are getting a number of different therapies, and it's very difficult for us to know whether these are beneficial, whether they are neutral, or whether they're harmful. There's a paper that just was published today as a preprint, so again, not peer-reviewed, that suggests that individuals who received hydroxychloroquine had a worse outcome than individuals who did not receive hydroxychloroquine. I don't know if that is a study that is going to be confirmed in a randomized trial. We have to wait and see, but it does point to the fact that any of these hypotheses, an antiviral effect, an anti-inflammatory effect, and which drug could do what, really is at this moment totally unproven. And the only way we'll get an answer to these questions is with these studies, which hopefully, and I think this will be the case, the results of which will be coming out in the next short weeks because there's been so much interest globally at trying to answer those questions.
Can I just add an appeal or add something there, which is completely agree, right? I think I think I was very disappointed, by, for instance, New England Journal's publication of uncontrolled remdesivir data that was completely uninterpretable, and we need publications like that to stick to their guns in terms of data quality. I think one of the real limitations or challenges is we have no, particularly on the anti-inflammatory side, is we have no idea where patients are in their inflammation cycle, right? So, hydroxychloroquine may turn out to be precisely this issue, which is, hydroxychloroquine, if it does anything from an anti-inflammatory side, probably hits innate immunity, right? So if you're hitting that early in disease, hydroxychloroquine or anything else that hits innate immunity, particularly doing that early in disease, you may very well have a deleterious effect on a native clearance of virus. Hit it later in the disease, and you may be tamping down innate immunity that's out of control. But all we have now really to judge where people are in is very, very, very rough markers, whether clinical or lab test based. We have no real idea no real way to see where people are in that cycle. And so without that,
we have to.
Oh, sorry.
Because we are out of time. Yeah. But I love the passionate plea from both of you, and I'm sure that Hannu has the same, to let science guide our decision making and to have science to the rescue here. With that, we're really out of time. Thank you all for being part of this panel. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. We love having these short and intense discussions. We look forward to having more of them. We are continuing this series. The next event will be in 2 weeks on March the 5th, on May the 5th, I'm sorry, at 1:30. And the panel we're still working on the details of the panel, but we'll announce it soon enough. Thank you again to the panelists this afternoon. Go out and enjoy the cloudy day in Boston. Cheers. Bye-bye.